I think we'll get a start on our presentation today. I'm Gigi Barnhill, president of the Amherst Historical Society, and it's great to see our devoted, small but devoted audience this afternoon. We're going to hear from Lincoln Anniballi of Natick, who's going to speak to us about Henry Wilson and his involvement in the Civil War. He's an undergraduate at Hofstra University, majoring in history and political science. He demonstrates what a love of history and dedication to a given topic can produce. He said to me, yes, he was kind of a history nerd as a younger adult, but it's just great to see this love of history really end up involving an important historical figure. We are stepping a little way out of Amherst today to hear about Henry Wilson, a white man who was sold into indentured servitude by his family, but rose from humble beginnings to become a U.S. Senator, a Civil War general, and Ulysses S Grant's vice president. He helped to found the Free Soil Party and later the Republican Party. And throughout his career, he was known for championing workers' rights for both blacks and whites and the abolition of slavery. So a very important historical figure, relatively local. I'm sure we can find lots of connections between Natick and Amherst if we really try. So please welcome Lincoln to the podium, and we'll introduce
Well, thank you very much. I will try to speak up to the microphone. That's important. So thank you very much to the Amherst Historical Society for welcoming me here today and inviting me. I do have a passion for history, a passion for Henry Wilson history, as I kind of term it, in the Civil War. So I got interested in Wilson at the start of 2020, about when the pandemic started to get bad, and I ended up doing a lot of research and thought that a podcast about Henry Wilson's life would be something that would be interesting, as there are about 3 contemporary biographies about him. I thought that he's, a lot of people don't have time to sit there and read a book that's 1,000 pages long. History lovers like ourselves find the time, but people who want to just casually learn about history have been, resorting to podcasts for that. So I wanted to create a well-researched audio biography of Wilson. So that's kind of where my interest in Henry Wilson was sparked, and how I got led down this road of delving into the life of Henry Wilson in the Civil War. So I am a sophomore at Hofstra University, which is a university on Long Island. Drove up today, but pretty quick, not bad, about 2 hours and a half, which is easier than driving all the way home to Natick, which is usually about 4 hours. But so Wilson was from Natick, Massachusetts, as am I. He actually lived in the same street as I lived. His cemetery was on the same street. I lived in the Henry Wilson Historical District. Went to Henry Wilson Middle School, but I honestly never knew who he was or what his story was, why all the stuff in town was named after him. I knew Henry Wilson was the vice president at some point, and he was from Natick, but that's about where my knowledge expanded, and that's true for most people in the town. So when I started to do just like light reading, like just checking out the Wikipedia page and some other websites, I was just astounded to find that his life was so impactful on the history of the country, and yet even in his hometown, very few actually know about him. So, like I mentioned, I worked on a podcast, which in total created about 20 hours of content related to Wilson. It was a lot of work. It took about 2 years in total to do. I spoke to over 15 different researchers and authors and historians, and like I mentioned, I wanted to do an audio biography, so it goes from his birth all the way up a little bit past his death to the end of Reconstruction. So in my presentation today, I will go through his life, but if your interest is piqued, feel free to check out the podcast at henrywilsonhistory.com. It's available online or anywhere that you might listen to podcasts. So, starting with Henry Wilson's early life. He was born in 1812 in Farmington, New Hampshire. His parents were Abigail and Winthrop Colbath, and they were incredibly impoverished. Their grandparents had come to America before the American Revolution and settled in Farmington. And Farmington was a agricultural town, still is, but it's in New Hampshire, of course, so that doesn't provide the best agricultural conditions. Very stony soil, of course, very brutal winters, and so poverty was very common in the area. And it's still a very small community. There's only, I think, about 5,000 residents today. It was much fewer in 1812. But his parents named him Jeremiah Jones Colbath after a wealthy farmer who lived down the road. They hoped that naming him after this wealthy farmer would allow him to get some of his inheritance when he died, which I think is a great example of just how poor they were, that they were really desperate for anything, that they would prefer to name their first child after just some rich guy rather than kind of care about what they would name their child. Everything they did was based around how can we get some income, because they were so desperate. His father, Winthrop, was an alcoholic and couldn't really ever hold down a job. But Jeremiah, from a very young age, was really interested in history and reading, and he loved to learn. And this isn't a time before public schools were existent, really. So you had to pay to go to school. Of course, his family had no money, and what money they did have, they spent on food. So school was not Abigail and Winthrop's top priority for their son, but he did get to go to school. It's estimated maybe once or twice every couple months if they could scrap up the money. But Abigail especially saw that their child had a passion for knowledge, so she used to take newspapers and give them to him. But there's actually a great story of Wilson and a schoolboy got into a little scuffle at some point, and an influential woman in the town named Amherst Eastman, whose brother-in-law became the governor of New Hampshire. She broke them up and said, why are you fighting? You shouldn't be doing this. You're going to get all dirty. And the boy ran off, and Wilson stayed. She said, can you read? And he said, of course. And she actually brought him back to her home. And a motherly nature bond was formed between her and Wilson, where she would loan books to him and clothes. So that's really where he had access to books throughout his childhood, where otherwise he likely wouldn't have. And at 16, he was indentured as an indentured servant to a William Knight. This is actually a really cool picture that I discovered in my research that was never uncovered beforehand, but that is actually the Knight farm. They were wealthy in Farmington, and Wilson's Jeremiah Jones Colbath at the time, but Wilson started working for them at about 11 years old, and then at 16 he was legally bound to them. So what indentured servitude is a type of class-based labor. It was legal, so you would bound someone out for a set period of time. In his case, it was 7 years, I believe, was the contract. And at the end of that, you'll get paid something. He was offered a yoke of oxen for 8 years of work, which was about $80. And with inflation and everything over time, that amount is of course more today, but it still was very little money than what was common for a salary. But he was indentured. He was an incredibly hard worker. Worked very hard on the farm, and just continued to read and loved reading. And would always, it said that he would replay the books he read while he was doing the hard work in the field. But overall, Wilson had a very sad childhood. He had no friends. He was very lonely, and he had really no prospects for the future besides just going and following the career of his father and kind of the others in Farmington at that time. One more note on indentured servitude before I go in. It is different than slavery, whereas enslaved people had no legal jurisdiction at all, whereas indentured servants were bound by their contract, which was held in law. So that's an important difference that I delve a little bit more into in the podcast. So in 1833, Jeremiah Jones became free of his indenture. He was paid $84 for his 5 years of service. But again, he had actually been working a little bit longer before the actual contract was signed. So he was given $84. He was given farm animals, but he sold them quickly. And the animals that he was given, he actually was charged to keep them at the farm overnight. So that's just how kind of callous it was, callous nature. And it was about 50 cents, which of course, when you only have $84, 50 cents is a significant amount. But Wilson had a passion, and he went to the New Hampshire state legislature and petitioned to change his name to Henry Wilson. It's not really known why he chose Henry Wilson or exactly why he did this, but I think the prevailing theory is that he just wanted to leave the past behind him. He had some disdain for his father, who, as I mentioned, was an alcoholic. He would later become a major temperance activist, and he just wanted to leave Farmington and kind of start something new. So he changed his name to Henry Wilson. There's also that he knew that his name came from that wealthy farmer down the road, Jeremiah Jones. So he wanted to just leave the poverty behind him and try and make a name for himself somewhere else. So he looked for some jobs, and when he did find jobs, he always saved his money. He was very frugal. And then he saved up. Once he saved up, he departed New Hampshire by foot and walked 100 miles all the way down to Natick, Massachusetts. He first walked to Boston, actually, which was out of the way, just so he could see Bunker Hill and the publishing company where all his books came from. So he was just amazed by history, and he loved history, despite never actually getting a formal education. So once he got to Natick, he was apprenticed at a shoe factory. Shoemaking was becoming very common in the region at this time. It wasn't quite as big as it became in the later years, but it was just getting started. He was apprenticed, and then he, after 2 weeks, decided he could do it himself. He bought out his contract and actually started his own shoe business in Natick. So he became known as the Natick shoemaker later in his career. Like I mentioned, the shoe industry was just becoming a major force in the economy. Wilson made these type of shoes, which are called brogans. They were actually sold to Boston markets, who then sold them to southern plantations for the use of enslaved people's feet. They were very cheap shoes. You wouldn't be comfortable wearing them, but they were really easily made and could be shipped very easily. So that's why they were used for the enslaved people. So it creates this contradiction in Wilson's life where he later becomes very anti-slavery, but he's also buying into this slave economy, which I think shows just how dominant this was in the United States at the time. Wilson would term this the slave power. So no matter what you did or where you worked, some ways you were playing into the hands of the enslaved person's master in the South. So he was an incredibly hard worker. He once tried to do 100 shoes in 24 hours. He only got to 50 before he just fainted and collapsed. And there's an interesting quote from his landlord who said, he's always in rent on time, but he's just always banging at the shoes. So he loved to work, loved to save his money. And the reason why he was working so hard was because he wanted to try and buy himself a college tuition so he could formally educate himself. But before he could do that, he got acquainted with some of the Natick socialites at the time. There was only about 800 people in Natick. But they formed a debating society where he fixed a speech impediment that he had since he was little. He'd only read, he never actually publicly spoke, so they really helped him learn how to speak and grammatically form his thoughts. And then he became very ill in 1836 because he had possibly a lung hemorrhage, which I would theorize would be because he was breathing in all of the leather from the shoes that he was making constantly. And so his doctor told him to go to the south because the humid air, that was a common recommendation for people who were sick at the time to go to a warmer climate. So he went to the south. He decided to go to DC, which is not as far south as you're supposed to go. But he was enamored by politics and by history that he decided to go to DC. And while he was on the train ride, he saw enslaved workers working in the fields of Maryland. And he was just shocked by this. He actually turned to the person next to him and said, "Can you believe this atrocity is actually happening in the United States?" And the person next to him said, "If you say that again, you'll be arrested," because that was something that was illegal at the time to express those types of sentiments in Maryland, especially. And while he was in the city, he saw slave blocks, which that is an example of one that is in Richmond, Virginia, that is still a memorial today. But it is where slaves were auctioned off. Families were separated there, and he saw this happening, and he was just shocked that this was something that was, actually happening, and that was real and happening in the United States. It's also said that he went to a congressional debate and they were talking about slavery. I doubt that was true because slavery was censured at the time. So congressmen, senators, they couldn't talk about slavery because the South had kind of filibustered rules where you can't talk about this because it was so divisive. Those rules were later chipped away at, but it's again showing just how ingrained this slave power was in the American system. But coming home, he was inspired to fight the slave power and to try and defeat and abolish slavery where he could. And he was once again kind of sparked with an inspiration to jump into politics. So once he got back to Natick, he began associating himself with more Natick politicians and more socialites, and of course working with the debating society, which he helped to form. He ran on the temperance ticket, actually in 1838, and then he lost that election. But then he ran again and won in 1840 with the temperance ticket again, but he quickly became a Whig. Party politics is something that is very important throughout his life. He went through kind of two different political party systems, going from the Whigs versus the Democrats to the Free Soilers and Know-Nothings and kind of the Republicans against the Democrats to the Republican-Democratic system that we somewhat have today, although the parties have switched a lot in their ideological leanings. But he became a Whig, which was a more anti-slavery party. It was not, I shouldn't say it was anti-slavery because it wasn't. It was, it believed that slavery existed and that it existed in the South and that the North really shouldn't have any say in it. It was very passive to the idea of slavery. Politics around this time cared more about the economy and about the national bank. Those are really the main drivers of the political debate. But Wilson, while debating with the National Bank, would always talk about anti-slavery politics as well. That got him in a lot of trouble with the Whig establishment in Massachusetts. The Whigs dominated the Massachusetts State House at this time, very similar to how the Democrats dominate the State House today. So you really couldn't be successful in Massachusetts politics if you were a Democrat. You had to be a Whig and part of that kind of Whig establishment. But he kept getting reelected and kept pushing on with his anti-slavery speeches. And he honed his political skills and became friends with Charles Francis Adams, who was the grandson of John Adams and the son of John Quincy Adams, and Charles Sumner, who becomes famous later in the lead-up to the Civil War, which I'll talk about in a coming slide. William Lloyd Garrison, who was the nation's leading abolitionist throughout the road to the Civil War, throughout the war, said around this time that Wilson's speeches were the greatest anti-slavery speeches in all of the legislatures in the country. So very significant. Around this time, he also got married to Harriet Malvina Howe. He got married to her in 1840. Actually, the night of his wedding, he wanted to leave and go campaign because he was running for that seat, but it was too stormy, so he couldn't. Probably to the delight of his new wife. And then soon after that, he had his only son, Henry Hamilton, and Wilson was a family man. He loved his family, loved his son, and always worked to keep them with him, moving from Massachusetts to Washington. But Texas had become a huge debate, whether we should admit Texas to the Union, whether it was Mexico or whether it was its own country. This was just a major divide in the country. And the Whigs and Democrats, neither really had a side on it. It was more in-party fighting. But then the Whigs nominated Zachary Taylor, who owned enslaved people and was a supporter of accepting Texas into the Union. And Wilson led the charge at the party convention to leave and form their own party, which was the Free Soil Party. So as a Free Soiler, the Free Soil Party was dedicated to stopping slavery's expansion into new soil, which was gained by the Mexican-American War. So Texas, Arizona, California, Colorado, all of those states, the question was, should this be slave states because they are south, or should they be free? And this is a question that continues all the way up to the Civil War. But as a Free Soiler, he became a major national anti-slavery figure rather than just within the state of Massachusetts. He formed a coalition with anti-slavery Democrats, with George Boutwell in particular, who was from Groton, Mass. And I spoke with Jeffrey Boutwell, who is a distant cousin of him and actually working on a biography right now, which should be coming out within the next year. Very fascinating story of George Boutwell, who lived another kind of hidden Civil War person from Massachusetts who was very close with Henry Wilson. But they formed a coalition, and that was really central in getting Charles Sumner, who was a really radical anti-slavery figure, elected to the Senate. It was because of Henry Wilson that Charles Sumner was able to win. Wilson was very good at politics. He knew how to use the legislature to his favor to get what he wanted, and what he wanted was getting Charles Sumner elected, which was very difficult because, as I'll talk about, Charles Sumner was radical not only in his beliefs but in his rhetoric. So he would say really not very nice things to his adversaries, personally attacking them rather than just sticking with the politics of it. But Wilson, the Free Soil Party kind of falls apart, and then the Know Nothings come about, which was a secret organization that was actually very anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, but they were also anti-slavery, especially in Massachusetts. They won all but 2 seats in the Massachusetts legislature, and Wilson joined the Know Nothing Party, which is one of the biggest blemishes of his career, although he was always pro-immigrant. So he had to kind of do this balancing act where he would say like some anti-immigrant sentiments, but always say that he was accepting of accepting people into the country, and of course the Catholics as well. Edward Everett, who voted for the Compromise of 1850, which was a major compromise in the road to the Civil War, that was very pro-South. The Massachusetts people were done with Edward Everett after that, and since the Know Nothings had the State House, they got to choose who the new senator would be, and the Know Nothing Party was split because they said, Henry Wilson is not anti-immigrant, he does not represent our party, we should not elect him as senator. But again, Wilson kind of talked his way into the nomination. It was a national story that he would become the new senator somehow, and once he got to the Senate, he was elected as a senator, and once he got to the Senate chamber, there was discussion of would he sit with the Republicans who were just kind of barely forming, or would he sit with the Know Nothings? He sat with the Republican Party and became a key leader in the formation of the party, which was dedicated to anti-slavery overall, not just expanding slavery, but stopping slavery where the Constitution would permit it. So before we actually jump into the Civil War, there's a couple things about the road to the Civil War. So starting with the Brooks-Sumner affair. So Charles Sumner, of course, the friend of Wilson from the early days, in the State House, he just about a year after Wilson gets there, Preston Brooks, who is a Southern House of Representatives member, he comes into the Senate chamber and just nearly kills Charles Sumner with his cane. And he did this because Sumner had gone on this long speech that went on for 2 days and was like 100 pages long, and went on and on about how Southern members are having affairs, sexual affairs with the system of slavery, which was just completely radical language and got a lot of people angry. And so this pro-slavery representative came over and whacked him over the head. And Wilson had just left the Senate chamber when this happened, and actually nodded when to Preston Brooks, because Wilson got along with everyone, including his pro-slavery colleagues, which is why he was very effective as a political leader, because he could make friends outside of the political situation. And he was also not bound by his party, as he was very welcoming to new parties and new ideas, that he would switch parties if he felt that the party that he was currently with wasn't holding the standard that he wanted it to. But Sumner's beaten, and for a while, Wilson was kind of the only senator from Massachusetts, because Sumner just couldn't serve because he was so badly concussed. And Preston Brooks said, "I want to duel Henry Wilson," and Wilson said, "That's not going to happen because I don't believe in dueling." And but he said, "I'm going to kill you," basically. Brooks said this to Wilson, and so Wilson was very scared for many years about getting assassinated. So he always carried arms on him, just because he had a family at home and he didn't want to risk that. He actually sent his wife and child home, and this was a very scary time in his life. And it's very representative of how tense the country had come around this issue of slavery. So, also, Bleeding Kansas was a huge thing that was happening right about the same time, and it was kind of a mini civil war happening in Kansas. Kansas was being admitted as a state. They were tasked with the question of whether they would be slave or free, and there was a lot of fraud in the elections, and so it broke out into violence. And Wilson actually went to Kansas and was working to raise a lot of money in New England to try and fund the campaigns of the pro-free faction against slavery, of course. So Wilson raised thousands and thousands of dollars, brought it back to Kansas, and then violence continued to happen, and it wasn't resolved until the Civil War. Dred Scott was a enslaved man who, this is a separate story leading to the Civil War, who was an enslaved man who traveled to free territory. He petitioned and said that he should be free because of that. And the Supreme Court ruled that the Black Americans could not be citizens of the United States. They could only be citizens of a state. So if an enslaved person went to another state, they were still enslaved in the state where they were from, and that state had a duty to turn them back. And this, again, just blew up the nation because it was a shock that the Supreme Court would rule this. And John Brown was getting caught up in all of this tension, all of this fervor. He was fighting in Kansas, killing people, and he was very anti-slavery, extremely. He used very violent methods, of course, of trying to free enslaved people. Wilson and him did not get along because Wilson was a political man. He agreed with John Brown about we should end slavery, but Brown said we need to, murder all of the pro-slavery masters and congressmen, while Wilson said we need to do this through adding an amendment to the Constitution. And John Brown said this is just not right. We're just how terrible the system of slavery is. It needs to be stopped now by whatever means, whether that's constitutional or illegal. So Brown raided Harper's Ferry, which was an armory, and he ended up was executed for these actions because he wasn't successful. had this big plan to lead a revolt into the South and free all of the enslaved people. And this happened in 1859, which is 1 year before 1860, which was one of the most important elections of this country's history. And Wilson knew this. He wanted the Republicans to win in 1860, and he thought that Brown's actions ruined their chances because Brown, a lot of people were scared that they didn't want violence. They believed, a lot of people were not super anti-slavery even at this point, but they were scared by the violence that John Brown's raid exhibited. And so Wilson thought that this would lead to Republicans losing because Republicans were, Democrats said, look at Republicans are just like, they're all John Browns. And so Wilson still never liked Brown, but after the war, when Wilson was writing his history books, he regarded Brown as a hero. So it's still debated today the degree of which Brown is a hero, but I think he's certainly an interesting figure in himself. And then, of course, the election of 1860, there were these four political parties because the country had become so divided. There was the Republicans, represented by Abraham Lincoln. There were the Democrats, who was represented by Stephen Douglas. There were the Southern Democrats and the Constitutional Union Party. The Democrats wanted to preserve the Union and use elections as a method to determine whether a state should be slave or free. So you get to vote. Should the state be slave or should it be free? And Republicans said that slavery should be abolished in northern states, and that there were many different views about how to deal with slavery in the South. But it should be stopped. It shouldn't be expanded. Was essentially their core principle. The Southern Democrats said that slavery should just be allowed, essentially, and that the Southern Democrats were formed to split the vote, so that a Republican would win, and the South would have a means to say we should secede. So they were the most pro-slavery faction in this race. And then the Constitutional Union Party said, we just need a compromise to save the Union, and what that compromise would be determined on would be, of course, over the issue of slavery. But the Republicans won. They didn't win a popular vote. They just won in the Electoral College. They didn't have a majority. So Lincoln was elected as a minority president, and the southern states began to secede before Lincoln is elected. And the nation is just thrown into a crisis of what does this mean for the Union, for the future. So secession doesn't necessarily mean violence, and violence didn't come just all of a sudden. It was, for a time, it was, what is the North's relationship going to be with these states that are seceding day by day? Wilson said this is going to turn violent. He said we need to prepare, because it seems like Lincoln had a very pro-union idea where he said that it's unconstitutional for states to secede, and they had no right to do that, and they had no ability to do that, so therefore they were still part of the Union. They were just in a fantasy world saying that they had a confederacy. Either way, Wilson said this is going to turn violent, and he called on Lincoln to raise 300,000 troops. Lincoln and most others laughed and said, yeah, right, we're not going to need that many. A few months later, they would use Wilson's number to raise troops. But a lot of stuff happened in this early days period that I'm able to delve into a lot in the podcast, which is really great. But a couple really anecdotes that I like is that when Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, he served as the chair of the military affairs in the Senate before he left. And Wilson was also on that committee. And when Davis was physically leaving the Senate after he delivered a speech that said, I have to leave because I believe that this fight for secession is bigger than me, bigger than this institution, so I'm going to become the president of the Confederacy. He walked up to Henry Wilson and shook his hand and said, I'm sorry that I'm doing this, but this is a cause that we both think is much bigger than ourselves. And he said, quote, I hope we meet again in calmer times. And so, again, that shows just how close Wilson was with his colleagues on the other side. And Wilson would go on to fight for Jefferson Davis, it's wrong, Jefferson Davis' release. I'll have to fix that. Released from prison after the war when he was arrested for treason, of course. So Wilson became the chair once Davis left, and he worked on the legislative side of the war. So anything related to how many soldiers we had, what the soldiers were wearing, their encampments, what was supplied to them, all of that passed through Wilson's hands. And he wrote the Conscription Act, which was the first national draft. It was a very scandalous thing to do because citizens at this time had a very states' rights mentality, even in the North. They said the federal government should not be drafting men, the national government, because it was very state militia run. So that's actually a part of the riots, which were some of the worst in the nation's history after the draft. That's an example of a riot in New York City, but they were in Boston and across cities across the North. But they were effective in raising troops. Wilson actually led the 22nd Massachusetts Regiment, called the Henry Wilson Regiment. He did not lead, he led them in a political sense. He funded them and wasn't the military leader for them, but he did work he was a lieutenant colonel in the Massachusetts state militia at the time. Wilson worked very closely with Secretary of War Stanton and President Lincoln. He spent most of his days were in the White House with the cabinet, and that's why we don't have a lot of paper correspondence, because a lot of what he was doing was highly confidential, because there were Southern spies. And one of the most notorious Southern spies is that woman in the top right corner. That's Rose O'Neal Greenhow, who Wilson was rumored to have an affair with, actually, in the early days of the war before Bull Run. She was a socialite in Washington. She was very close with President Buchanan, and she was friends with Henry Wilson. And there are these love letters, so-called, that are in the National Archives today. They're titled Henry Wilson Love Letters to Confederate Spy Rose O'Neal Greenhow. Of course, they didn't know she was a spy at the time. But in the research for the podcast, I was able to, for the most part, disprove that these were Wilson's letters. I think, so it turns out that he had a clerk who worked in the office of his committee, whose name was Horace White, H.W. And it's believed in Wilson's other biographers have concluded that it was his love letters, because it's not in Wilson's handwriting. It doesn't use the same language that Wilson used. And of course, Wilson was a family man. He loved his family. And he was also extremely busy at this time. There was really no time to be sneaking around with Rose O'Neal Greenhow, who was really a celebrity in Washington. But Greenhow would later be arrested for her covert activities and became a celebrity in England, actually. But then she would, her boat would be capsized by the Union Navy, and she ended up dying before the war ended. Another important part of Wilson's kind of early days in the war was his work with Clara Barton, who was the founder of the American Red Cross. This was before she founded the Red Cross, but she worked very closely with Wilson in getting soldiers what they need and supplying them with hospitals and care. And that was really a lifelong relationship that continued into the next period of Reconstruction. But before we go on to kind of after the Civil War, it's important to talk about Wilson's work as an anti-slavery politician, as a civil rights advocate. Wilson fought for the use of black soldiers. He believed that if we used black soldiers after the war, they would, the whites of the North would recognize these people fought for us, and we should honor them with voting rights. So he really fought for black use in the military, and then that was granted by the Lincoln administration, by legislation that he supported. And then once Black Americans were incorporated into the military, he fought for equality. Black soldiers were paid $10 with $3 subtracted for clothing and food, while white soldiers were paid $13 an hour with a $3 stipend for clothes and food. So a huge discrepancy in pay, and Wilson fought to end that. He was not totally successful in doing so. After the war, he got kind of post-compensation for a lot of these things, but equality was not popular, and franchising African Americans was not popular either. So Wilson was a radical. He was viewed as a radical with both his colleagues and of course his foes in the South. But in 1862, Wilson wrote the D.C. Emancipation Act, which freed all of the enslaved people in the nation's capital in D.C. Wilson had to compromise on this bill, so he paid the slaveholders to free the slaves. It was a requirement. You couldn't choose not to accept the payment. But Wilson disagreed with that morally because he felt that these are humans, you should be paying for them. But he thought that that was worth gaining their freedom, because in the end they were, of course, emancipated, and that was used by President Lincoln as kind of the basis for some of the Emancipation Proclamation. And Wilson he got along with President Lincoln, but he was always a thorn in his side, because Lincoln was more of a moderate. Wilson was, of course, a radical, and he would always say, whenever they would have military meetings, Wilson would always end with, can we do something about black equality and black civil rights and actually ending slavery, because slavery was still happening during the war. And Lincoln once saw Wilson and Sumner and the Speaker of the House, Thaddeus Stevens, walking towards the White House and said, here come those three damn fellers again. They're here to bother me. But Wilson was, of course, successful in pushing Lincoln, especially in the days near the end of the war. Like I mentioned, he was passionate about equal rights when very few were. And then in 1863, he actually founded the National Academy of Science, which is still today an institution of our government that focuses on research and scientific studies, which is really important. And it's incredible to think that someone who had no formal education was able to found legislatively this incredible institution. So after the war, President Lincoln is assassinated, and the nation is again thrust into chaos. It's fascinating to think of just how chaotic just this 5-year period was. We had secession, we had one of the worst war in U.S. history occur. Half the country left, and then we had a president who was assassinated. And the Congress was really left to their own to figure out what would happen with Reconstruction, how would these states be readmitted, black equality and black civil rights. But Wilson sat on the committees for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. He was really the main writer of the 14th Amendment, and of course he supported the 13th Amendment, which the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment extended civil rights to African Americans for the most part, and then the 15th Amendment gave voting rights to black males nationally. So Wilson was considered a radical Republican, which is this sect of Republicans who felt in equality and expanding civil rights. But he was more practical. He knew how to work Congress and get it done, and he was successful in passing a lot of the Reconstruction legislation. He got along with his foes again, and he worked to try and free the Confederates who were imprisoned after the war, because he felt that wasn't productive in moving the nation forward and reunifying and getting the South to sign on to these amendments. And he did get Jefferson Davis released from prison eventually after the war. And President Johnson, who is a really interesting figure in himself, but he started very pro-black Americans, and then right as soon as he became president, about a year in, he started to not support that so much. And the radical Republicans impeached him, and Wilson voted for it, but he said that because Johnson was infringing on the rights of black Americans, that's why he voted for it, rather than the more legalese reasons that were being put forth. So he was the first senator who was in favor of women's suffrage as well. A little bit less than 50 years after Wilson's death was that actually become reality. And in 1872, Wilson's wife Harriet passed away. She had sickness throughout her life. And during the war, I should mention that Hamilton Wilson, who was his son, served in Texas. And he was only 17 years old when he got involved. And then the war ended, and Hamilton Wilson stayed in the Army and was actually died of dysteria just about a year after the war ended. So Wilson was heartbroken by this. So was Harriet, which is the sadness and depression resulted in her death just a couple of years later. But a sad chapter in Wilson's life directly after the war. But Wilson was able to use his work to kind of get his mind off it and fight for a cause that he felt was greater than himself. So then, after Reconstruction, kind of during the period of Reconstruction, after Johnson Grant gets elected, and Grant and Wilson had worked together in military affairs. Of course, Grant was the great general during the later end of the war, and Wilson was the chair of the Military Affairs Committee. So they worked together. It seems like Grant really didn't like Wilson that much, and everyone was really surprised when Wilson was snubbed for vice president in 1868, or even just a cabinet position at all. But Wilson stayed in the Senate. He never said anything about it. He kind of just moved on, and then the administration was really rocked by scandals. And so they said, we need someone who has good character, good standing with the nation. They chose Henry Wilson and put him up as Grant's second term vice president. Just a couple months into his vice presidency, he had a stroke, and he never became rich. I need to note as well. He always was poor throughout his life. So he was never really able to get involved in these corruption scandals because he just didn't have the money to do it. But he was accused of it, and it did tarnish his career somewhat. But Wilson took a bath in the Capitol, which were these baths that were there because representatives who didn't have homes there in D.C. needed to clean up. He took a bath, had a stroke, and served out his about 3 years before he died. But he was expected to run. He recovered pretty much, and then had another decline in his health and passed away. In 1875, in November of 1875, he was expected to run for president in 1876, but his health, of course, was not allowed. But his death was greatly mourned throughout the nation, and he had the largest funeral procession in the nation's history, with Lincoln's as well. So he rode up from Washington all through Philadelphia, New York City, and then into Worcester, and then Boston, and then back to Natick, where he was laid to rest. So Wilson's legacy, of course, he lived a fascinating life, and he was a lifelong abolitionist in support of equal rights, just principle over party. He was the chair of the Military Affairs Committee during the war. Peace, Emancipation Bill, National Academy of Science, the Civil Rights Amendments, and then women's suffrage, and then, of course, his vice presidency. And then I have this one last thing, Watergate, on here, which, of course, happened about 100 years after his death. But this picture down here is a picture of Gerald Ford with Richard Nixon. But if you look closely, the desk that they're using is actually the Henry Wilson desk. And the Wilson desk was, after Wilson died, the Senate decided to dedicate the vice president's office in the Capitol, which was the room where he died, to be the kind of the Henry Wilson. They put a statue in there, and they had the desk commissioned later. And so that stuff is still in the vice president's office in the Capitol today. So there's a picture of Joe Biden as vice president with the Senator Mansion in right behind them is the bust of Henry Wilson, which I thought was a funny picture. But yes. But the Wilson desk was a favorite. Nixon thought it was the Woodrow Wilson desk. which was where the confusion came from. But President Johnson loved the desk and used it in his office in Texas while he was president, and Richard Nixon used it. Of course, the Watergate tapes put those on the Wilson desk. Gerald Ford used the desk in the Oval Office, and then Jimmy Carter writes in his memoirs, the first action he took as president, was to get the desk out of there because he wanted the one that John F. Kennedy had used. So that's a funny anecdote that I really enjoy to tell, because it just shows kind of how far-reaching Wilson's legacy is and just his entire life and how incredible the story is. So if you're interested in learning more about Henry Wilson, if you can believe there is more, there are so many other incredible stories that I wish I could spend all day talking about, but that's why I created the podcast, so I don't have to talk about it constantly. You can check that out at henrywilsonhistory.com. I'm working on kind of putting together a book of just the episode scripts and having that available on the website. But please check it out if you're more interested. And if we have a few minutes for some questions, I'd love to answer any that you might have. So thank you.
Great. So I have a question for you. I know from my own work when the pandemic settled that libraries were pretty much closed. And so I suspect you have done some really innovative internet searching. And can you just talk about that a little bit? Because it's so different from
I think we're really lucky to be in an age where so many documents are now available online. The Library of Congress has an extensive collection on the Wilson papers. Wilson didn't really have a lot of papers, which is unfortunate, just because he didn't know how to keep his papers. So that's not something that, if you were poor, you had no reason to, because there was no reason to have a legacy at that time. So he didn't know how to keep papers, so most of them were lost, but the letters and stuff that were sent to President Lincoln, those are all available online. And reaching out to different institutions, the Rutherford B. Hayes Library, they were all very central in sending me different scans of documents and accessing these old books online that have been scanned. Wilson's 3-volume book that he wrote as vice president, it was available at my local library, and then the Wilson biographies as well. I was able to get my hands on. So lots of materials that are available online, and I'm really indebted to those. To not only the researchers I talked to and interviewed for the podcast that are voices are featured on there, but also that were behind the scenes and sending me information. Yes?
When you talk about Wilson's early life, I saw similarities to Ben Franklin. You nod your head. Have you seen similarities? Very intelligent, energetic, driven people. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Wilson's life was very similar to Benjamin Franklin's, whereas they both had a very strong passion for different causes and for getting involved in different ventures. But I think it's in ways more similar to Abraham Lincoln's childhood, where I believe Franklin grew up somewhat, not necessarily impoverished, but somewhat middle upper class in his early years, where Lincoln is very similar to Wilson, where they had nothing besides really their families and the passion for knowledge. So I think something that you see with these politicians and these leaders of this era is that they had a drive to do something, and they didn't have really a means to do it, but they found a way to do it. Today we have so much access, like I just said, to online materials and books and libraries and schools. Back then there was nothing. So I think it speaks to the person, but it also makes you think, if these people could do all this stuff then, imagine what they could do now with the resources and things that we have today. And a person like Benjamin Franklin or Abraham Lincoln or someone like Thomas Jefferson, really incredible little lives and interests. So. Yes?
Could you clarify a little bit more about his Civil War service. You said that he was a general, but in sort of a political way. Does that mean he was never in the field with his troops?
So he was never fighting, but part of his role as chair of the Military Affairs Committee was to survey the battlefield. So after a battle would happen, he would go there. He'd be the first one there, check everything out, talk to the soldiers, and then he would come back to Washington and say, this soldiers need this, this, and this, we need to legislate this. But, so at this time, the Army was very different to what it looks like today. It was just militias kind of in states that would form together and fight. So Wilson, how it worked was that if you were a private citizen, you could put money up and say, I'm going to form my own regiment. So Wilson put forth the little money he had and formed the 22nd Regiment. And so in a political sense, people would do this and kind of be, this is what side of the war they're on, and purchase their, I wouldn't say purchase, but form these incorporations of militias to go fight.
I understand that there were sponsors.
Yes, exactly.
You have to kind of bring them together and stand behind them and promote them. And
Yes.
those people actually did the military strategy.
Yeah.
So that was his.
Yeah, that's a correct characterization. And Wilson's regiment was very successful in the war. They actually fought in countless battles, including Gettysburg, where they lost about half of their men. So it was devastating, but better than some other regiments fared. Great.
Well, thank
you
you.
very much.
We come back in 2 weeks for Ed Londigan's talk on his recently published book about Bathsheba Spooner. She lived in the Brookfields, so just the other side of the Quabbin. We're getting closer back.
Yeah.
She's a fascinating figure, so please come back in 2 weeks. Thank you for coming. And I guess that's it.